So thank you all very much for coming. It's a delight and an honor to have so many people here on a midday morning. What we're going to do is give a fairly informal presentation, sort of talking amongst ourselves, and then we really encourage you to ask questions, make comments, etc. So please don't hesitate. Well, this is the image. Can I see? Yeah. Okay. When people talk about Gaza, especially in the media, especially in this country, the typical images that are presented are like this one. They're almost always from the outside, exteriors. They're almost always anonymous. We seldom see anyone's faces. If we do, they're faces of rage or grief. And they're totally anonymous. So for us, the important thing, if you can sort of imagine zooming into any one of these windows and entering into the private space, the intimate space, the space of daily life, where you can hear the bombs or the sort of political noise in the background. But ultimately, it's daily life. This is where people eat and drink and take care of children and have all of the life experiences that are common to humanity anywhere. And what was important for us in this book was to enter into these spaces and to document these lives, looking at food, because food has this special character of being so intimate, so important to people's daily lives and families and identities, but at the same time, because it always comes from somewhere, it's always produced somewhere, it always circulates, it's always a sort of link from these small space of daily life and households out to greater economic and political circles. It serves as this sort of link. And so the endeavor of this book is very much to link these intimate spaces, get a sense of those spaces that are never represented in the media. You learn so much about a person or a family or a culture if you see, how their dishes are stacked in their sink. These little mundane details, these were really important for us to document. And to get a sense of who are these people, the consumers, the producers in Gaza, and how does the economy, the politics, everything that connects individual households to the greater political reality, starting from food and kind of working up the chain to the bigger picture. So
we should mention we started our field work in 2010. We always get this question, so we might as well get it out of the way.
Tell how we got started.
Right, how we got started. In 2009, I was here in the United States. Is this not? Should I lift it up further?
Yeah, as close to you as it can get.
And Maggie had just been to Gaza on what she sort of describes as a citizen diplomacy tour. Is that loud enough?
Can you hear her okay? Yeah, okay.
And she was interested in writing about Gaza using food kind of as the tool, the narrative tool, device, if you will. And she, in the course of her research, came across very little, essentially nothing, besides a few articles I had written on my own blog, Gaza Mom, and for This Week in Palestine. And so we began to correspond for her article, and along the way, the idea of writing a book appealed to both of us, but we couldn't get in at a time. There was a closure on Gaza. From 2007 to 2010, it was essentially hermetically sealed. So we kind of tabled it until such a time that the borders opened. And that happened in May 2010, for those who might recall, was the attack on the Mavi Marmara and the flotilla that was sailing to Gaza. And the border opened briefly, the Rafah crossing at the time, and so I said to her, you know what, let's do this thing. We just booked our tickets, and I flew to Cairo, drove to Gaza to the Rafah crossing. Took her a little bit longer, but eventually she got in. And having never met before, we just kind of hit the ground running, and for about 6 to 8 weeks, we visited women and farmers and agronomists and bakers and restaurateurs, and we just wanted to really get a very comprehensive look at the food system. Like so you get a sense that it's more than just recipes. It's using the food to tell the history, the current and the current situation and the history as well, and a little bit of everything can be explained, I think, through food in Gaza.
So maybe it's a good moment to look at the map and explain a little bit about, I'm sure most of you are pretty aware of what the current situation of Gaza is, but it never hurts to go over it. Our book describes the foods not only of, we did all of our field work in the modern Gaza Strip, which is what you see here. But the modern Gaza Strip is actually a sort of reduced version of the historical Gaza District. Before 1948, the Gaza District was an administrative entity, first under the Ottomans, then under the British Mandate in Palestine. And it encompassed, as you see on the map, a larger area, including Jaffa up in the north on the coast, or almost to Jaffa, not quite to Jaffa, up on the coast, and then a fair amount of agricultural inland, hinterland, and then most of what is the current day Gaza Strip.
And the idea was this region, even extending beyond the official district, all the way to Jaffa and to Bir al-Sabah, was considered really one region, shared a lot in common. People would regularly work, day laborers from Gaza in Jaffa, come back at night, and the same with Bir al-Sabah. That region kind of shares a lot in common. And of course, in 1948, you have this mass exodus of people being driven from their homes. Many of them end up in what would then become the modern-day Gaza Strip. That area is sealed in and the border is drawn. And thus you have about 80% of the population of the modern-day Gaza Strip are actually refugees from that region that we just showed you, which then makes it a really extraordinary place to encounter all of these culinary traditions, historic culinary traditions of the rest of Palestine.
One of the most surprising and interesting things we found in our incredibly rich fieldwork was the incredible localism of food. Families who have been in exile, have been refugees for 65 years now, that's into the second, third, sometimes fourth generation, still are very proud and very insistent to make each dish exactly as it was made in their home village. So villages that no longer exist, which don't appear on any map, which perhaps there's not any stone left of them because they've been completely erased, still we can taste them because within the refugee camps and scattered all over Gaza, these families continue to make their recipes in exactly the way that they made them back in their village, with accommodations to the different products that are available or not available. And part of what we were tracing, so in part we're doing a sort of, we call it a ghost ethnography or a ghost archaeology of these towns that no longer exist, and sort of trying to trace their recipes and their memory through the generations of refugees, and then also looking at how those recipes and those eating and cooking habits have adapted given the constantly changing availability of ingredients. Because of course, starting in 1948, many of these, for example, farming families now are no longer on their farms. They no longer have access to the fruit of their fields that were so much a part of their diet before the exile. And suddenly they're forced into refugee camps where the enormous bulk of their calories each day come from UNRWA, that is UN provided or World Food Program provided cereals. So instead of eating bulgur or frika or the more traditional grains, they're eating white processed wheat. Instead of eating a lot of the, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at doing this on this computer, so we have to flip through everything to get to anything. But enormously, the bulk of calories being consumed now in Gaza is coming in through aid, whether through the World Food Program or through UNRWA.
I love that gift.
Right.
Gift of USAID.
And being distributed through food distribution centers.
And we should say 80% now of the population of the modern-day Gaza Strip are what's referred to as food insecure or very close to becoming food insecure. So they're reliant in some form or fashion on this aid distribution in order to be able to feed their families. And we'll get into that, and we'll talk a little bit about the impact of the blockade. But maybe just rewinding quickly to the map, mention one more thing. It's also a good time to remind people, for those who aren't as familiar, of the isolation of Gaza, because we talk about Gaza this and Gaza that and the food, and then we sometimes forget that it is almost now completely severed from the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So there is a ban on the movement not only of goods but of people to and from Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem. And so that is also one of the contributing factors to why the cuisine is so relatively unknown outside of the Gaza Strip.
We also, as long as we're on the map, should talk about farming in Gaza. Gaza is a minuscule piece of land. It's very, very tiny. It has one of the highest population densities in the world. So it's current estimates 1.7 million people squeezed onto extremely tiny territory. And nonetheless, there is still farming. And in the last years with the blockade, there's more and more of a turn because many Gazan men, particularly men, not all exclusively men, worked in Israel, whether in factories or in farms, until 2000, when the borders were sealed to workers. Suddenly you have mass unemployment. And one of the keys that we're trying to express in the book is sort of a study of the forcible de-development of Gaza. This was not historically a poor region. This is a region that has been made poor in a very specific and very focused way in the last years. And one of the key ways is massive unemployment because of people's reliance. Before the 80s, many people were doing small-scale subsistence agriculture. There were then tremendous incentives for day laborers to go into Israel and work in industry and in agriculture. Then when the borders were closed...
It was off, apparently. Now it's really
when the borders were closed, that whole population is suddenly unemployed, inactive. Many of them try to return to small-scale farming, but of course the land has been urbanized. There's much less arable land available. And then if you look at the map, this pink line represents a sort of constantly changing no-go zone, a buffer zone. And because a huge amount of Gaza's arable land is actually consumed by that buffer zone, that's
something like half, right?
Yeah, most of the sort of coastal area you'll see is urbanized and populated, and then that area that touches on the border was hugely the arable agricultural land, and specifically the herding and pasture land. So much of that is now inaccessible. So part of what we try to study in the book is also how farmers... Here's a farmer we spoke to, for example. This is Mohammed al-Sultan. And he was telling us how his farm fell into the border area, was completely destroyed. His orchards, he had olive trees, fruit trees, and beehives, were completely destroyed by the land incursion in Kastled in 2008, 2009.
Which we should mention systematically targeted agricultural infrastructure, farms and colleges and this sort of thing, and almost completely cleared that area, that buffer zone area of the land.
So for farmers like this gentleman, who was a exuberant, ebullient, totally charming character despite this sort of heartbreaking tale he was telling us, for farmers like him, it's a big dilemma. You have these rain-fed, sustainable, historic trees that take decades to bear fruit. So if you replant them, dates, olives, citrus trees, and beehives to reestablish a bee colony, as we're learning all over the world, once a bee colony is destroyed and once the land around it is destroyed so it's not flowering, is incredibly difficult. So you have a constant, in addition to the sort of unemployment of those who are working as day laborers, you have the sudden impoverishment of people who were prosperous agriculturalists, like this gentleman, who their trees have been destroyed, and they're faced with a dilemma of, do you replant what you had and know that you're going to be 10 or 20 years waiting for those trees to mature in order to bear fruit and become profitable again, and who trusts that there won't be another ground incursion in the next 10 or 20 years while those little trees grow? Or do you try to grow fast-growing vegetables and horticulture? The problem in Gaza is that it's up against a a sort of, countdown in terms of water availability. And so the fast-growing horticulture that some organizations and NGOs is promoting as an alternative to unemployment draws from an already rapidly shrinking aquifer. And so every single little element, every place you scratch, every ingredient you look at in Gaza, there's an enormous story. There's a labyrinth of different positions and answers. Some saying that agriculture is perfectly, horticulture is perfectly sustainable in Gaza. It's just being poorly managed in terms of centralizing the control of drilling wells or catchment, water catchment, etc. Others say there should be no horticulture in Gaza because we can't afford the water. It's already in the sort of Armageddon countdown in terms of water availability for drinking and bathing, etc. So every different ingredient we looked at ended up having this long story and this debate. And one of the things that was really interesting to learn in Gaza, and that outside of Gaza you never hear about, it's certainly never represented in the media, is how alive that debate is within Gaza, both politically, socially, between different NGOs and organizations. How should we manage the limited resources we have? What should a tiny, isolated population do? Should we continue to farm as if maybe any moment the blockade will end, or should we accept that it's possible that this blockade will go on, and we should, focus on long-term sustainability?
This was a very topical discussion in 2010 when we were there, and something that we were, almost floored by. We had no idea that this was going on in Gaza, but at the time, the local Ministry of Agriculture, because there's two ministries of agriculture in the West Bank and Gaza. This is another thing we discussed, the kind of multi-layered system of government. You have, the UNRWA, you have Hamas, you have Fatah, you have the NGO sector. There's one more, then you have the Israelis. That's a whole other system. But anyway, there was a discussion going on, a debate about what Maggie was talking about we call it the debate about sustainability. Whether to, and they had put forth this, what was known as the 10-year agricultural plan at the time, to try with the idea that, okay, the blockade may not end anytime soon and we can never be fully sustainable, but let's at least try to work towards that goal by planting rain-fed agriculture, returning to kind of the traditional rain-fed methods. So olive trees, date trees, organic composting. There was pilot mushroom farms popping up. To try to make use of what was known as marginally usable land, something like that, land that couldn't otherwise be planted on. They would set up these little facilities and culture mushrooms. So all kinds of really interesting things, organic farms, wastewater management, to really shift what they call a strategic shift in the agricultural strategy.
In addition to so farming is an ongoing problem and debate. Also, for example, fishing. Gaza has a beautiful coastline. If there weren't for that Mediterranean coastline, I think probably everyone would go completely mad in Gaza. Something about having at least a horizon, even though you're completely shut in, completely caged from above. There's air control. All the borders are completely closed and controlled and militarized. But at least you can look out to sea, and that relationship with the sea, I think, is very important, both sort of psychologically and economically. Historically, for Gaza, it's a traditional fishing zone, but the sea is now, initially in ~94 with the Oslo Accords, there was a limit placed on fishing zones, and then that limit has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk to 12 miles, to 9 miles, to 6 miles, and now it's at 3 miles. 3 miles is still in very shallow water where there's really no fish to be fished besides the little juvenile fish. So Gaza's fishing industry is, like so many other industries, in total crisis. And the price of fish has skyrocketed, so most families in this radically and suddenly impoverished zone don't have the economy to be buying fish, which has traditionally been an important part of the local diet. So you'll get entrepreneurs like these two ingenious and totally goofy fellows These are Iyad and Ziad, they're brothers. Being with them is like being in this sort of stand-up comedy act. They're a riot. No stone is left unturned. Total political irreverence to meted out to all the parties, everybody. And they're very ingenious entrepreneurs, and they started Gaza's first inland fish farm. And since then, the fish farming has proliferated with totally minimal resources. They were telling us how they don't have the fuel. For example, electricity is a whole other story. They don't have the fuel to run aeration for their tanks, so they would have all the neighborhood kids come over and just splash like crazy, and that would aerate the water for the fish. So they're very ingenious, and they're raising mullet and tilapia. Most of the
very
Gazans,
profitable, we should say, because the NGOs caught wind of this and then adopted their model across the Gaza Strip and began to, and they now have, they give the little, they sell the fries, the fish to the NGOs now. So instead of selling the fish themselves, they sell to the NGOs.
So yeah, apparently this is a whole emerging market in aquaculture. Of course, the Gazans are not that keen on tilapia and mullet compared to sardines and fresh sea fish that they've been eating for generations. But in families that don't have often the economy to choose, it is at least a sort of welcome source of protein. But yeah, this was sort of one example of the constant adaptation at a sort of small-scale cottage industry level, like these guys, at a home level as families adapt to what ingredients are available and try to continue to make their traditional recipes that mean so much to them in terms of identity and family. And I mean, we all know that there's nothing like the taste or the smell of home. and so people are bending over backwards to produce the same recipes that their families have been making for generations with a constantly changing array of ingredients. We have some shots just sort of the markets just to get a sense of what Gaza looks like. We never see these images. So
and that there's still some farming. So, this woman is one of the few farmers left. She has her one cow or something?
Yeah, this is a very small scale subsistence. This Falah woman has one cow. They milk the cow and make kishik. I don't know if you're familiar with kishik. It's a fermented wheat and milk product that's then sun dried. It's a historical way of preserving dairy before refrigeration. This was a standard way of conserving dairy. And she was in the market. She brings in her basket of kishik and fresh herbs and sells them in the market. So there is some small-scale subsistence agriculture as well as imports. Sorry, these are all.
Want to talk about the
Gaza
kitchen, or what are we? The Zaytun?
Sure.
Or where were you going next?
Yeah. No, go to Zaytun.
Yeah. This is a sort of a women's cooperative community kitchen in the Zaytun district of Old Gaza City. And something like 14 women come here every day, and in a room that's maybe no bigger than 8 by 12, cook up just a storm of things for families, for professionals, catering for weddings. And for them, it's, a means of empowerment, but also of income. And many actually are breadwinners in their families. One of the women, I don't have it with me, but we like to show one of the women that we met makes her own maftoul, which is the Palestinian version of couscous. And she sun dries it and she packages it. And she has since been able to put labels on her maftoul and, of course, sells it locally because there's no exports now out of Gaza. But she supports her brother and his family, something like 14 members. And again, it's this tiny little kitchen that we were lucky enough to go and we feature in the book.
But it's an example of also one of the other virtues of looking at food. Right. Is that you get this other side of the story. We like to say that if you go to Gaza, poor Gaza is so bombarded by media and by journalists that everyone is prepared with a sort of official discourse about the borders, about I mean, it's not official imposed by anyone. It's just everyone's so accustomed to speaking to journalists that you have your sort of speech all prepared for talking about the borders and the situation and politics and this and that. And you know, you see a foreigner with a camera coming and everybody sort of prepares themselves to give the speech. And then when the foreigner with a camera suddenly asks about lentils, no, I want to know about lentils. How do you prepare lentils? How did your grandmother prepare lentils?
He throws them off.
People are totally unhorsed.
But then, you know, yeah, they very actively will, you know, one example is, I think it was one of the first days we were there in my mother's clinic in Gaza City, and we were discussing with someone, you know, the idea behind the book and trying to get some leads on who to visit next. And one of the doctors, a male doctor, sort of heard us in the room before and came out and said, wait, did I hear you say, you know, whatever it is, okra and lentils or, you know, food? Let me tell you about Ottoman land distribution laws in the 1920s and my father's farm in Jabalia and the way that we make okra and lentils, and it must be made with garlic, not onions. And he just sits there for an hour, you know, was this kind of encyclopedia of information on this matter. So that happened again and again and again. We were constantly surprised by how passionate people were about the subject and how willing and open they were to discuss and share with us their very intimate private spaces like this that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. I think also being women was, you know, and having access to women's spaces was something you don't often see in the mainstream media.
In general, you're sort of, as a journalist, as a foreigner, as a person with a camera, your interlocutors tend to be men. But as soon as you ask about food, the authority is usually, not always, but usually women. So you get sort of referred to the kitchen and to the women's space. And as we all know, the kitchen is always sort of the epicenter of what's going on. The kitchen knows the family stories, the intimate and personal stories. It also, of course, goes to the market, knows about the economy, knows about the politics, knows what's coming in, what's not, what's available, how prices are fluctuating, how politics influences the availability of cooking fuel, of different ingredients, the situation, what's happening. So the kitchen is this very sort of privileged place to learn about all of those different things.
And also it tends to be a protected space because the public, I don't know if you want to say the public space of food or face of food tends to be men, right? And generally in the Arab world, or you get the kebabs and the whatever. You don't get the home cooking or the home meals. Yeah. So we can go on.
So going back to the Zaytun Women's Cooperative, you have massive male unemployment, and one of the interesting things to discover in these intimate spaces, in these kitchens with these women as interlocutors, is that family dynamics change, how families are structured, evolve given the circumstances, and suddenly with massive male unemployment, there are a lot of women seeking out ways to keep their families afloat. And this was a sort of prime example of these women said, okay, what do we know how to do? We know how to cook. How can we turn this into something that will keep our families afloat? Because many families are receiving food aid, but the food aid is never more than about 60% of their actual caloric needs. So there is an urgent necessity for a cash economy. And while in Gaza no one is starving, and this is very explicitly the Israeli policy towards Gaza, no one should starve, but everyone should be extremely tight. And the official line is no development, no prosperity, no humanitarian crisis. So people are receiving enough to stay alive and not be hungry. You don't see visibly hungry people. And again, sort of journalists that want to demystify, undo the myth of suffering Gaza, go and take pictures of the supermarkets and the shelves are stocked with
but there's
imported
Snickers bars, but there's chips, but there's sodas. How are people starving? And one economist we spoke to, Omar Shaban, said, yes, there may be 10 varieties of sodas on the shelves, but who cares if nobody can buy them? And that's the whole point, reading between the lines and understanding the deliberateness of this policy and what it really intends to achieve is not humanitarian crisis, not, again, people, and well-intentioned activists and otherwise you'll constantly hear, oh, but, people are starving in Gaza. No, that's not the case. they're hungry and they can't, and these things are available, but they don't have access to them because of the deliberate policy that intends to deprive them of prosperity and development and just the means to survive, essentially.
So you have women looking for any little way of having some margin of cash economy in order to supplement the aid they receive and bring in those fresh products that don't come in the aid. The aid that people receive is flour, sugar, salt, cooking oil, and some kind of legume. So that doesn't include any fresh food, and any fresh food that people can acquire relies on a cash economy, and in many, many, many families, there is no cash economy. There's no cash income. So this little minimum payment that women, for example, like these Zaytun cooking ladies, can achieve, suddenly makes it possible for their children and their families to have fresh vegetables, meat, etc. Again, everything is available. You go to the markets, and they're flourishing with fresh greens. This is molokhia, kusa, all of these beautiful vegetables, some locally produced, some imported. The question is, does anyone have that margin of cash economy with which to purchase them? And that is everyone we spoke to, the nutritionists, the NGO, the aid workers we spoke to, everyone affirms that the levels of anemia and of diabetes are now endemic in Gaza. So while you have a population that isn't starving, there is a really high level of malnutrition, especially among children, and they can chart that level of malnutrition directly in relation to the blockade and the various different moments of sort of strike against the Gazan economy. Cast lead, with its very specific focalized destruction of the productive economy. We always cite the example of 11 operating chicken farms in Gaza. 7 were directly destroyed in cast lead, and the others, all the chickens died because they couldn't get fuel to keep the chicks warm because it was the middle of winter and very cold. So there was a sudden chicken shortage in all of Gaza, and it took a few years because the borders are closed and it was extremely difficult to bring in fertilized eggs through the tunnels, etc., to reestablish the livestock population in Gaza after that took a few years. So all of these little blows to the productive economy there, and any possibility of sustainability there, each one of those can be sort of charted against child nutrition, for example. And
not to mention the longevity of aid goods, things, like Maggie was saying, the white rice, the flour, all this kind of stuff is meant for a short-term crisis, not one of the extended nature that Gaza has been subject to. So that, of course, also contributes to the anemia and malnutrition and so forth.
People are receiving rations for emergency situations.
Right.
Emergency situations are understood as floods, landslides, etc. Brief, short-term emergencies. This emergency has gone on for 65 years, and in fact becomes more and more grinding as time goes on.
And again, while certain things come in, especially when we were there is a kind of absurdity associated with what is allowed in and nothing is allowed out beyond a few items that the Dutch government lobbied feverishly to get out, like some carnations and strawberries. But really nothing is allowed out, which is, of course, a huge blow to the furniture industry, the fishing industry, as well as the farming industry. But what's allowed in is also very specific, and this list constantly changes. At that time, it was extremely absurd in 2010, and it was highlighted by the time by John Kerry and Keith Ellison, who visited and found that pasta and lentils were not being allowed in. 1 week it's cilantro, the next week it's ginger, who knows. And then there's a very specific chart that determines the exact caloric requirements per person in the Gaza Strip, and only enough things will be allowed in to meet that caloric requirement. And it's in line with the policy that was referred to as the Gaza diet by the then advisor to Ariel Sharon, Dov Weisglass, who said the objective of the siege is not to let Gazans starve, but to put them on a diet, not let them die of hunger, but put them on a diet. So again, certain things will get in, and it constantly fluctuates depending on the week and the month, and how much media attention it's gotten. If it's too much of a crisis, they'll kind of scale it back a bit and so forth. Constantly fluctuates, but the point in the end is really targeting the productive sector and, again, not allowing people to take that step further to become self-sustaining.
One of the interesting things we learned doing the field work is how functional Gaza is to the Israeli economy also. If you look at the weekly the weekly list of what is allowed and what is not allowed to enter, it's totally surreal because 1 week bananas represent an acute security hazard and the next week bananas are fine. So it's almost comic if it weren't so tragic, but it's also directly reflects the
method to the madness.
Right. The method to the madness is that it directly reflects Israeli agricultural surplus. Whenever the Israeli market begins to wallow because there's been an overproduction of one thing or another, because the season, suddenly there will be dumping, agricultural dumping, into Gaza. The gates will open to that particular product and it will enter Gaza. This is, of course, a nightmare for Gaza's farmers because they've been working all season to bring tomatoes to market, and then suddenly there's a dumping of tomatoes and the price for they can no longer earn anything at market with their tomatoes because the market is awash in
and
tomatoes.
It's a one-way system, we should say. It's not as though there's some kind of interaction or negotiation or, get your input. Well, this week, what do you think? You guys need some tomatoes? No, it's literally like, we don't know. I mean, the Karni Commercial Crossing, or is it the Kerem Shalom, which is the only one that's open, solely controlled by Israel, and they decide when they want to open it and what they'll allow in and how much to allow in on any given day.
So one of the interesting observations that a number of economists and NGO workers that we spoke to highlighted is Gaza is one of the most overserved parts of the planet in terms of aid organizations, NGOs, all of this effort coming in. Everyone is concerned with Gaza, trying to keep Gaza alive, but in circumstances that Gaza in no way controls. So besides being totally anti-democratic, of course, all of the money that floods into Gaza to keep it afloat despite basically insane circumstances, then has no place to go but consuming Israeli products at jacked up prices. So anything that's overflow from the Israeli, whether agricultural economy or sort of food industry, then gets brought in, sold in Gaza at increased prices. So every dollar that enters Gaza as aid ends up back in Israel at sometimes a 200% increase. Because Gaza is like a cage full of people who have been reduced to the status of consumers. And they consume whatever is coming in because they don't really have anything else. There is no choice. And so all of this aid money that comes in ends up back in Israel at a highly profitable increase. So that's another one of these little sort of, is there method to the madness?
See, and here you thought you were just getting a cookbook of recipes.
So we'd like to take questions. We could go on all day, but we should leave some time for questions. Yeah.
I just want to thank you, first of all. This is really fascinating, and
we have so much more. Obviously,
we could go on and on.
And I wish you could, but I just wondered, were you aware, sort of, that food was such, like, it's obvious that it's kind of a political and economic and almost human metaphor for so much in Gaza? I mean, were you aware, sort of any of these ramifications, or maybe you could just answer what struck you most about your experience over there in terms of, what food signifies over there? What surprised you the most, or what had the biggest impact?
I mean, I think we were definitely both aware, and that was kind
of the reason. At least we had the intuition.
Right,
no?
exactly.
There was a sense that, like, maybe this is and then our intuition was again and again confirmed.
Yeah, we
more
definitely
than we ever
sensed it, but I mean, not to this degree. You're right. We were kind of, again, floored by the degree to which it was, like you say, a metaphor for everything else. In terms of what surprised us the most, I think Maggie maybe mentioned the degree, the regional specificity of a lot of these recipes, the degree to which people, generation after generation, retained this regional specificity of and really very passionately defending, visiting, and again, Gaza is a small area, but going from Gaza City to, Deir el-Balah, just whatever it is, 20 minutes away, and speaking to Ibrahim, who's a 90-year-old refugee from Beit Tima, a village off Gaza's eastern coast. I have no idea how to make summagia. That's a Gaza City dish. I mean, I don't know. Go ask the Gaza people. For us in Beit Tima, we only use onions, never garlic. I mean, that's something that you guys do here in the city. So, and we saw this again and again, not just with her as a first-generation Palestinian refugee, but with third and fourth-generation refugees as well in different refugee camps in Maghazi and elsewhere. Same kind of thing. No, our village, Karatia, was known for onions. That's what we were famous for. We never used garlic, ever. I mean, and again, talking about a very small area the size roughly of Rhode Island here. So
this
I think,
like I'm sorry.
Sorry, just to add a little tale. For me, the most surprising thing, the shocking thing, and the absolute confirmation of that initial intuition was just how excited everybody was to talk to us. They were thrilled. Everyone, but people falling all over themselves to tell us about lentils or about whatever. And the passion that food ignites, and the pride and the enthusiasm, and how deep it goes into people's sense of themselves and their families and their history, and how incredibly generous people were with bringing us into their homes, spending all day, telling us their stories, cooking this, cooking that. No, but then you have to talk to the neighbor because she's really good at this. And generally, when you're doing field work, especially in intimate spaces and people's homes, it's hard to get people to let you in and open it. We had the sense that we couldn't possibly go to as many houses as we were invited to. The sort of opening up and generosity and bringing us in and eagerness to tell these stories was what most floored me, and was most, it was an honor to do this field work, really.
And, I think that also confirms what we frequently have said, that food is a way to bind Palestinians together, it locates them and identifies them where maps and modern dictionaries fail to do so. And that's another important element to this whole project, is that for us, we think of Gaza as kind of the case study, the key to understanding the conflict as a whole. Understand Gaza and you will understand what's happening in the rest of Palestine in so many different levels.
I have two questions.
Oh, sorry, there's a mic, I guess, going on.
Just let her go. I've had the very good fortune of sort of stalking these women. And this is, I think, the third event I've been able to attend, and it's been wonderful. And you've sort of referred to this, and I've heard you speak of it other places, but could you go into more detail? I mean, obviously you could have a shelf full of books of specific recipes because every family and every location they came from has specificity. No onions, no garlic, whatever. Right. How did you decide which recipes to use?
That was hard because we had about 3 times as much content as what you see here, and it really pained us to have to, apply the chopping block to the text. But in the end, we tried to choose recipes that were both unique to the region, but also some that were kind of pan-Palestinian, while reducing those that were common across the Levant. We do include many that are common across the Levant, but that was kind of our, the criteria that we went with.
It was also a matter of circumstance. I mean, field work is also sort of a question of, I think we had a sense of which recipes were absolutely had to make it in. But then of those, there's a half a dozen versions. And so which version do you, well, we include little notes about versions, but at the end of the day, largely it was because we really liked this person that taught us how to make this one, or in the end, a lot of it is sort of hazard. I was and a selection of what we best liked.
Somewhat obsessively, I was trying to record, every last detail, and Maggie kept saying, "You can't include every variation." I said, "I know."
I was doing the layout, so it was like it doesn't fit on the page.
And I should say, the research continued way beyond our time in Gaza. So it was always this kind of anxiety associated with codifying these recipes, because I was worried somebody from XYZ village would say, "Why didn't you include this in there?" And it happened a few times. Somebody in California would say to me, "How could you not include fatet ajir in there? Are you kidding? That's sort of the..." And I said, "What is this?" And then I was panicking, "Maggie, we haven't included this." And then we would try to find it and call people in Gaza. And, So there was a fair bit of that going on as well.
For that, we have to give special thanks. Oh, they're not here. To Layla's parents who are here, who were our
they're back there.
who are our point people in Gaza. They answered innumerable last-minute questions, ran errands. Could you go and ask that lady we talked to and find out if?
And it would seem really absurd. Like one example is I wanted him to fetch him or my mother, one of them, the recipe for salyadiya rice, and we had it, this really famous rice and fish. And we had one version of it from Yafa, but we wanted the one from the most famous fish restaurants in Gaza. And so my mother went over there and had to spend like half an hour convincing Abu Hasira to give her the recipe. Absolutely not. It's a family recipe. There's no way. But it's going to be in this really famous book. And and she finally managed, to convince him. But my poor mother was scurrying around all of Gaza doing these really absurd things like this. So
yeah. Also putting up with us while we did the field work, which was...
I have two questions. First of all, has the change in the fishing limits been a legal change or an effective change? And secondly, when you look at Gaza on like Google Earth, it looks very, very urban. And what is the percentage of farmable land to housing or building, and are people gardening on the roofs?
Oh, really good questions. The first question was about fishing.
Effective.
All of
this is just effective.
Yeah, I was going to say, because all of it is the murky legal waters, and whether it's the fishing zones or whether it's for example, Gaza is considered still effectively occupied. But ask Israel and they'll say something else. But no, it is all effective. And
as are the buffer zone.
Right.
The buffer zone grows spontaneously. Suddenly there will be leaflets and farmers will be informed that it's no longer 200 meters, it's now 500 meters, 600 meters,
and they'll know because
meters.
Somebody shoots at you, right? And then you realize, you can't. And then, like she was saying, they'll distribute flyers
and then you have to teach the kids, you can't play beyond this fig tree because
right.
beyond that fig tree, you'll get shot. But then suddenly, the next week that changes. So it's very volatile, very unpredictable, and entirely effective rather than legal.
And the Gaza is urban, but I think that something like, is it half of the area is considered farm? Is it a third or half?
I don't know that.
It's either a third or half is considered half. Yeah.
Outside the buffer zone.
The buffer zone constitutes, I believe, a third of that arable land. Yeah, those are the statistics. So it is urban. The urban areas are kind of concentrated in Gaza City, in Jabalia, in Rafah, whereas Khan Yunis and the farming areas tend to be further north. Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, Beni Sela. On the eastern villages, you have a big swath of farmland as well. And in the center, then you have the central villages, Zawaida and Deir al-Balah.
And then as for little gardens, yes, people are definitely, almost everyone we spoke to had, barrels of dirt with at least...
This is a Palestinian phenomenon, by the way.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
But with at least aromatic herbs and sort of little mini household gardens. Also, while we were there in the year or so previous to our trip there, a lot of the NGOs are funny. They work sort of by fashions.
Right,
There's different, often conflicting ones. Often they step on each other's toes. There's a lot going on. That's a whole other story. But one of the fashions at work at that time was rabbit farming, rabbit hutches, promoting raising rabbits on rooftops.
Yeah.
So to often women-headed households or very impoverished households, they were distributing breeding pairs of rabbits and rabbit hutch-making materials, which was a good idea, and it was interesting to see a lot of people were substituting rabbit for chicken in basic recipes. But also it's really hot in the summer in Gaza, and those rooftops get really hot. So I don't know how long-term viable rabbits on rooftops really is. But people are definitely trying raising doves, raising rabbits.
And a lot of it has to be knowledge that's passed down, as we learn, because, when you're in the third or fourth generation and you're not familiar with the farming methods, some of the people that we met, like a woman called Sultan, learned it from her uncle who passed it down to her, and she was able to restart their farming practices, purchase land. But for a lot of these people, they don't know how to farm any longer, and Some of them are more innovative than others, and you find some, like, you know, this one woman, Adula, who was almost had a completely self-sufficient little operation in a tiny space, using the gray water to feed the herbs and then throwing the cucumber peelings to the chickens and so forth. So you see a lot of that going on as well.
Hi. Laila, I'm Maggie. I haven't met Maggie yet, but excellent food. I kind of.
He can attest.
I know. It was good. It was very good. Yeah. Actually, my question is regarding in the book. I know globally. I mean, there's this tendency of having the fusion. You know, the fusion aspects of local food. So, did you touch upon that, or did you, during your research, found some sort of the new generations are kind of cutting corners? Because you know the old the way to make the food the old way is more laborious, and you know. So in that, I mean, did you pick on that in the book? Just curious.
Definitely. I mean, I'll give a specific example of. We talked about the kishik, the fermented wheat and dairy mixture, and when we spoke to Ibrahim, the 90-year-old woman from Betima, she was giving us the really traditional method to make the actual mixture, because you can buy it in the market, but she was giving. And then her daughter-in-law popped in and said, no, but I live in Qatar, and there we make it in this really quick way that doesn't require 30 days of fermentation. You can do it in like a week. And she explained and put it in Ziploc bags in the freezer. So definitely a lot of that. Same with the kanafa. We have this very traditional, laborious method and kind of the quicker home. Yeah, but there is still.
And I mean, preferentially, because we had to choose, because we couldn't possibly fit everything we would have liked to into this book. Wait for volume 2. Because it wouldn't all fit, we did opt preferentially for sort of traditional, and because we conceived what we were doing. Right. Partly as this sort of food as a way of describing the situation in Gaza in general, and partly as a way of documenting these sort of treasures of Palestinian culture which haven't been documented anywhere. So to some extent we did take this as a heritage documentation and looked mostly at the traditional ways, but we do, I think, point to places where, for example, the hundreds of thousands of Gazans that were working in Israel every day for decades, of course, acquire, they eat at fast food restaurants in Israel. They acquire those tastes. They get used to them. Some of them come back. Some of them don't. They start up. So you can get schnitzel at almost any fast food joint in Gaza. And that's obviously coming from the Ashkenazis.
The other interesting thing when we were there was the introduction of Thai restaurants, because after the doors to Israel were closed, so many Palestinians ended up going to Southeast Asia to study, and then came back and opened up, all these little. Thai was the new thing in 2010. So you will see this, but again, because Gaza is so closed off now, that's happening less and less. There's not interaction with the outside world, and therefore.
But we had one woman who kept sending her daughter off to check on internet for recipes for things, because she was very concerned about, she was very health conscious, and she wanted to find sort of low-fat vegetarian versions of traditional foods, and so she kept sending her daughter off to check Epicurious or whatever So yeah, I mean, people are connected, and there are tendencies and there are trends and there are new ingredients that suddenly show up, and everybody says, what do we make with that?
Yeah, and that's really interesting too. Again, along the lines of, there's a surplus of something, it comes in, nobody knows what it is. Again, in 2010, it was galangal root, which, we saw it everywhere. I'm like, what is this? I've never seen this before here. I mean, I knew what it was, but they said, it came from Israel, and we don't know. Now we just throw it into the broth, and, a little bit of research, we discovered, guess what? That was like the new spice in Israel that year. And so there must have been a surplus, and they dumped the rest of it in Gaza, and, so.
If you want to go.
Okay. Oh, is that it?
No, this gentleman.
My name is Samar Chatterjee. I think from the description you gave us about the situation in Gaza, at least it tells me that Israel is pretty capable of running a very brutal colony compared to the Europeans, like the British and French, who were the colonial thugs of the last generation. and they ran brutal colonies, but this is one step ahead, and United States is, of course, in collaboration and in conspiracy with them. Given that, and you said nothing goes out of Gaza,
Or very little, yeah.
except some bad missiles, maybe you should find some better missiles Israel can dump that will hit the bad guys in Israel, like Benjamin Netanyahu and some of his brutal people that are running this kind of a colony.
Yeah, I'm
So-
sorry, I'm going to hand it over to my co-author because my baby's screaming back there, but
Sure.
please continue.
Okay, so given that situation, I'm wondering whether your food recipes, can you develop some food recipes that will make the Israelis a little more civilized after they eat it, so that they can at least stop expanding their, new areas that they are occupying and make a two-state deal?
I'm afraid that's out of our range. Beyond our range. So, are we up? Thank you all so much for being here. Totally a pleasure, and we'll continue chatting over snacks. No, or have we eaten all the snacks?